Okay, this is, I guess I'm going to try and clean up some of the things, or at least add to them. So just to elaborate on some points and to revisit some of the subjects that I brought up, which were tangential, but which were perhaps embarrassing without sort of bolstering them with some extra qualification. Where to start? So sort of just to retouch on the subject of the kind of the complaint against patriarchy and things like that, which is sort of has a Jungian manifestation of that critical, of things that are very similar to that. Well, they're not similar perhaps in the content, but they're similar in the sort of in the style and the kind of political resonance or whatever. But just to touch on that subject, to me, a lot of the corrosive or things that are complained about that are problematic within patriarchy have nothing to do with men. And in fact, we're all created essentially to pander to women's status seeking and their investment into the kind of the surety that is provided by a kind of by societal fabrications which clothe their particular decisions in a kind of guarantee, in a societal guarantee, and which also then allows them much more fluid or direct access into what you could call like hypergamous, sort of the short-term gratification essentially of outsourcing responsibility and accountability, and just sort of relying on a system that has to pander to you on the level of the individual. And so, and this can be seen as the exclusion of women from political accountability. But when you compare the asymmetries between the sexes and the asymmetries between, for example, sexual competition and sexual strategies within our species, you see that there's an incredible opportunity cost for women that actually essentially don't profit or benefit from their value as a sexual object. So there's an incredible perverse incentive which only culture can ameliorate. And in fact, it is women themselves as individuals that orchestrate the culture which they have always been a centrally driving factor in. Even within patriarchy, you could very well say that culture essentially conformed to the expectations of women, which operated as a block, which leveraged their power as a block. And you can also see how that also is antithetical almost to democracy, that their introduction to democracy without without having to endure the same kind of cultural practices that men have had to endure, in terms of the fact that because men have to pay the cost of war and they have to pay the cost of political decisions, that at least they have the right incentive to make sure that they are being led and governed in a politically principled way. So because it's their neck on the chopping block. Whereas women can sort of find a way to be captured if they're on the losing side, if they're on the politically losing faction, or if they're they can be absorbed and reinforced. At least when we're dealing with conflict within our own species. Obviously, when we were in conflict with other hominid species, that's perhaps not quite the same, but. Again, like this has its roots when in those earlier times, because essentially, if we lost skirmishes, we only lost the men, whereas the women were protected, and therefore we could essentially outbreed our the other hominid species, and so because of that that, let's say, pro-social strategy that collectively was generated by the specialization of roles within between the biological sexes, we had an edge on the other hominid species, but it has had an internal cultural cost, which, for example, the Neanderthals probably did not have that cost because they hunted together. They essentially had they didn't have specialized roles between the sexes. Although I think they probably suffered from their culture was intellectually rich in probably other ways, but because there was less of a dynamism, there was less of a kind of complementary efficacy which had to be generated and cultivated within human culture. We have a richer, although a more potentially disastrous permeations of potential synthesis within this realm. So, I mean, you could say that to a large extent, all of our intellectual capacity comes from. Well, I mean, this is this has been known within Jungian thinking for a long time within the realm of eros, and it has been made even more complicated when we lost some of the animalistic adaptations, which made us rely on culture more. So, for example, because we cannot smell if children are related to us, we cannot know, or at least the male cannot know paternity for sure. That requires a cultural supplement and an intellectual edifice, and you can also see that this is had to be supplemented by and developed within at least the masculine role within the dance of culture as it is, and it is a dance that is not as if both partners don't have insight and empathy and vision of the other corresponding role, and it is a tandem enterprise. But in as much as women have organized their activity as a block, which has had pro-social consequences, because as I've said, like using the heuristic, essentially a lot of this is the residue of heuristics. So because essentially if women were selfish, and as long as that they were biologically able to procreate, essentially it was worth it for society to put up with borderline personality disordered women, because they offered greater number to the tribe, which essentially created a kind of an in-group power source of power or advantage against other groups. And so there's a huge pro-social incentive essentially to tolerate essentially toxic psychic poison, essentially, and if there's a way to tolerate, to immunize culture and to, let's say, create other heuristics that can at least contain the toxicity of I mean, so okay, I'm generalizing, I'm talking about female borderline personality. I mean, it is true obviously that men also have borderline personality disorder, but we're talking about there's a huge disparity in numbers here, and to the extent to which it still even exists within our society, because I would say that perhaps other hominid species that didn't have the gender, because the asymmetries between the biological sexes had to be imprinted within some kind of cultural armistice, or at least structure or model, that has created avenues and opportunities for you can almost call it a witchcraft of social morality, that can conceal things and that can be used to sort of oh my word, it's so embarrassing, I can't remember people's names. Perret Girard's work on mimetic desire and things like that, I think somewhat relate to that subject. But anyway, So a lot of the forms of false respect, or let's say hollow respect, that we have, I think um, are generations essentially of placating women's interface, uh, which is not quite the same interface, because at some point the rubber meets the road, and essentially you have to have enough people that provide value as a creditor within the system in order to keep the fabricated aspects of the system, the cultural values, functional and operative. Um, and so at some point someone has to actually bear the brunt of the burden of let's say the projection and stuff like that. And if the projection outweighs, let's say, the actual underlying value and meaning in the system itself, the whole thing collapses. So although obviously there is a large contingent of men who, I mean, so I'm basically saying that you can say, I think that, what is generally regarded as toxic patriarchy, to the extent to which toxic patriarchy is a problem, it is in complete sympathy with feminine expectations. Um, and it's actually recreated at quite an early level, at quite an early developmental level, and it's recreated independently of culture. It's not merely it's not imprinted. It doesn't rub off from the culture. It is invented by the individual, by the opportunistic element, because it is actually viscerally there. It is quite accessible, and women can access this quite readily. And I mean, in some sense, you could say that this has to do with the general notion of the feminine or something like that, which is quite. I mean, I think that these things are more biologically imprinted within us, that we have a symbolic, somewhat linguistic, that then our linguistic animism sort of fits with, but just the basic feelings and such. That actually is carried more from the feminine than it is from the masculine. I think the masculine is much more of a tabula rasa than the feminine. And this residue that we sit with comes from the female quarter. And their unwillingness effectively to reconcile these sentiments and things like that with the high level of sort of trade-offs that have occurred in order to create a platform upon which, I mean, there's so many things within our culture which are, let's say, from a biological perspective, or from like a purely sexuality sort of point of view, are just like wholly unnatural, let's just say. Like most men in our historical line have not been fathers. They have been the disposable masculinity that the system has essentially, while preserving and preferencing women, and that having nothing to do with their intellectual integrity and their cultural value that they bring to the table, but merely for their biological a pro-social advantage that they give to the group and to society. And so we always have to actually see within, I mean, if anyone has to do shadow work, it's women that have to do shadow work in terms of, and men, I guess, have also, that have fallen in line with these ways of thinking and these sorts of ideological machinations. This seems like a chauvinistic thing, but I mean, it's so fucking obvious. It is so patent, that a lot of the bullshit essentially is the fanciful thinking of convenient female heuristics. That isn't it easy, because if you know the expectations, then you can actually have a hypergamous sexual strategy. If there aren't, if there aren't rudimentary, fundamental, like pervasive values that are shared, like you need to have a really strong sense of stereotypes in order to make the female interface with culture viable, right? And if they're not willing to adapt that interface, well, this is the shitstorm that we live in today, effectively. And essentially it has come from the silencing of the male voice, from the silencing that no, we need to step back to historically give some kind of precedence for a woman to rebalance things. I mean, it's completely absurd. The idea that women can't take honesty, or like that you can, and so you get this huge double complex of double standards where essentially men have to put up with the criticism of, let's say, the masculine style of critique, and then this other array of these arbitrary, ad hoc, unsystemized, disorderly sort of things that merely privilege identity for its own good, as if identity is its own moral value, or something like that. And as that has created a toxic moral code, and then it says that it must just be given the space, that it must go without critique, that it must go without inspection, and that its inspection is always premature, that it must only happen after some advent or something like that. It's and it sustains itself by continuing to be one-sided, effectively, and it doesn't listen to the other side. And I mean, effectively, all of that sort of, and if you want to sort of abstract out the value of that way of thinking, is that you end up in a narrative. But I can also arrive at that same conclusion through another line of thought, which I'm going to get into. It's really ironic because, these so-called Jungians directly fall foul of the Jungian maxim, "What you resist persists." It's perverse. With their reactionary ideology of critical theory, which I'm going to get into the explanation of this. It is encapsulated essentially within the substitution of that spiritual knowledge, or FI, with the lesser FI, which is essentially you're trapped within a dialectical model of a kind of mechanistic system, and essentially that sort of ionically projects this narrative, which you just have to sort of, that is the medium of your life. You're trapped within that crystal, that frozen conception of culture. And its weird sort of demands, and you just have to always be on the right side as you sort of are trying to promote balance, and this is their general creed. This is what they have fallen into, which again I always find incredibly ironic, because these are the sorts of things that they should be, as Jungian supposedly, that they should be sensitive to. And I'm going to describe this again now in another way. So when I was talking about the 5 different distinct consciousnesses, in some sense, and their internal dynamics, and I know that I'm describing this superficially, and I said that those 5 are made up of 3, which are kind of a trinity, which are more ethereal in some sense, and they have 3 parallels to them, and only 2 of those 3 parallels, which are in more materialistic in their matter, in their substance, and all of these things are abstract from the beginning. So I know that I said that some are more material and some are more ethereal, but they're all abstract, and essentially in how they relate to reality and things that go on in reality, essentially you can only correspond them with themes, and some themes are deeper than others, and some themes are they each have their own dynamic sort of level of substance and content, and they all also interrelate with each other. And so the whole thing, looking at it sort of naively, is just is very hard to get into it. But what I'm just basically going to say is, because the spirit, or Fi, is the only parallel of that trinity that does not fall within the seat of consciousness, which is made up of those 5 distinct consciousnesses, that spirit, therefore, that Fi, is actually almost the intercessor between the mind, the realm of the mental, and the external matters and things like that. And so when you come across external matters and things that are happening in people's lives, there are elements, there are lots of many different elements that are, at least metaphorically and symbolically, and can in some aspect be mirrored into the themes that deal with all the different levels of psychological reality and things like that. And so the actual mixing ground, the thing at which these things like actually correspond, is that that one level of introverted feeling, the spirit itself. So because and it's good that it is one of those aspects that essentially is parallel, directly parallel to a very important one of those 5 consciousnesses which are at the center, but does not fall within the center of self, because then it really would be a solipsistic existential existence. And so then there are, let's say, matters that the spirit deals with directly, that are parallel with the mind's internal stuff. And then, mind has its own... sorry, let me just get... I'm going to read out some of my fragmented notes in wanting to add this. So the mind or consciousness, or when I say consciousness, I kind of mean the mind and things like that. I'm trying to make distinct jargon, because I don't want to mix it. I don't want to say too many things that don't correspond with Jungian jargon. They relate heavily to the spirit, and the spirit is not internally parallel with the seat of consciousness. But it is parallel with one of the seats of consciousness, but it is not internally parallel with the entire complex that makes up the entire seat of consciousness, essentially, which has those 5 seats. So the spirit is enmeshed with non-mental phenomena, and therefore its significance is of both. It relates to the complex of the seat of consciousness, and it relates to other, let's say, spiritual matter, but not which is parallel with one of the things, and then that one of the thing has a whole other complex of internal dynamics between itself and the other levels of psychological reality. Okay, so the seat of consciousness. So the spirit is therefore an intercessor or translator between the correspondence of the seat of consciousness with the world. It corresponds between the world and the mind. Sorry, I'm just trying to go through something. While being related. Significance is... why did I write things better? Cool. Being related. Okay, I think I did actually say that, although I can't read my own writing. Okay, and then I just went on to complain more about Jungian's use of themes and symbols in balance, and how that essentially, when you're trying to balance these themes, it just ends up being a kind of a very puerile form of image thinking, apart from the window dressing that they add to their general intellectualism. How did I get to that? Oh, that's from the page. Okay. Yeah, so I guess this is I'm just going to talk abstractly here, I guess. So, when you have people that don't reason from principles, they reason from conjecture, and they don't understand the subject except on a superficial level. They assume that if people don't already agree with them, um, you force them to make a negative argument, effectively, an argument to prove a negative. Because they basically have a general unawareness of the underlying reasoning attached to the subject matter, and they're not really interested in actually going into it because they conjecture, and whatever kind of heuristic, sort of low resolution narrative that they're using is good enough. And they just essentially end up with a table thump demand for intellectual sympathy, which essentially is that narrative, and which essentially manifests itself also as a kind of as a general sort of narrative. And sadly, it has an inbuilt excuse for itself, because it's an infernal abject agnosticism, even though the end of the tunnel of their process is a kind of mechanical is a kind of mechanical dialectical system, and which is also, I think, ironic, because they always give this sort of implicit promise that that they're sort of so grand and intellectual and sort of beyond these kinds of these rigid systems of order, but it's just that they've got a kind of a murky version of that. They've essentially got a way of obscuring that by encapsulating it within a narrative, but essentially at the end of the tunnel, that's what it is. It's just a kind of mechanical dialectical sort of internalized antagonism, and you just sort of have to in a kind of perennialist sort of ethos, you just have to keep on shifting to the right side, in the sort of never-ending dance, and this really, I think, amounts to a kind of weak agnosticism, and it's just leaving the king to drown, leaving the sovereign thread, the sovereign cord of sanity to be jettisoned. And then I just had another way of formulating FI is how it should be, is the notion, everything that forms into the formulaic preposition, how it should be, how things should be. So anything in the light of the mind, in the grammatical cognited spirit or intentionality of this is an object that represents how it should be. And this thought, this notion represents how it should be. That intentionality, that contemplation of a notion of that sort, is exactly what FI is. That's the form that FI takes. How things should be, how it should be. It in a particular example, things in a broad sort of framework or something like that. Now, if you're going to be agnostic as to if there is any way to actually bring that about in a kind of or to contend such a notion, now that is exactly what the spirit is, and that's how the mind can also relate through that issue to the world, and issues of the world can relate through the spirit to the mind. And the thing that actually crowns the mind in itself, in its internal complex, which doesn't even relate to the seat of consciousness, has to do with why things are the way they are, why it is, the question of why itself in essence. And essentially how it should be, is not the pinnacle, right? It's where the rubber meets the road, but you still need an engine in the car. You still need other things. You still need other internal things. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop this recording because I've got things to do. But the issue is that the why, right? The why is not going to be found externally. The why is not going to be found even in the symbols. Or fragments of themes, and trying to balance fragments of themes and trying to fulfill some kind of mechanistic dialectical, you know, and just be part of some kind of, you know, nice little narrative that seems to account for everything and linguistically has a kind of designation and category for everything, and then we've got like the right sort of language game to play and put everyone in and then order them around and then have some kind of a group-think authority that sort of pervades the system and polices it, and that essentially has no real grounding, because it has to essentially continue to be agnostic in order to conceal the murkiness of the narrative and the sort of the hollowness, really, and the abject and puerile pseudo-intellectualism of merely obfuscating the issues and the need that the realm of the spirit genuinely holds and portends to all these matters. Anyway, so I mean, I'm going to say something rude, I guess, which is just that, you know, it is, again, you know, ironic that we have these fake Jungians and these fake Marxists running around, and they're just real fucking fascists. That's what they are. They're groupthink narcissists, you know, and it's unfortunate.